I gave you a definition last time, what I mean by Judaism. The post-exilic revival of the Hebrew religion based upon an increasingly legalistic interpretation of the law, whose essence is set forth in its four major tenets: Sabbath, circumcision, monotheism, and anti-idolatry. Now, in this study tonight, what I want to do is attempt a balancing act. In describing Judaism last time in an introductory fashion and in providing my own definition of Judaism for you, I came across rather negatively, and that was, of course, obviously on purpose. It wasn't a very pleasant look at Judaism, a very suffocating, legalistic type of religion that is characteristic of declining Jewish faith in the ITP and the New Testament period. So what do I mean by balancing act? Well, tonight I want to start off on the other foot, a positive one, and say that we do see somewhat the continuance of legitimate Jewish laws in the New Testament. The problem with Judaism is its perversion of some of these, or of its divorcing the intention of the law from the letter, the spirit from the letter of the law. And you're going to find, as I warned you last time in Judaism, I said that it is a very complex issue. The books on the subject are enough to fulfill anyone's desire for a library. It would pack out an entire library, just the books that could be obtained on all of the minutiae of Judaism. And so you're going to find over and over again, and it's not because, it's because of what I said last time. I'm going to be cutting things short, and that's not usual around here to just say this is all we're going to say on it. But Judaism just goes on and on and on and on. You're going to see it tonight. I'm going to give you a brief representation, and it's going to be rather long with all the list of things. But we're just going to give you a list of some things and look at some passages. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. And it's because those things don't really fit in ITP. Judaism is a whole subject in itself. So just remember that. I'm not trying, in other words, to skirt some issue. And I'm not really apologizing for not trying to skirt some issue. I'm just saying that's the way that it has to be in a study like we're doing on Judaism. So let's start off on that positive foot, the fact that we do see a continuance of legitimate Jewish laws. Legitimate. That means they can be based on the Old Testament in the New Testament. Number one, I'll give you a list of these, and we're going to take the time just to briefly look them up. Number one, we see circumcision. Now, what I find interesting about some of these things we're going to discuss is that, as soon as you turn your pages from Malachi to Matthew, you change gears in your mind. And right away you think New Testament, cross, church. In other words, you think the death of Israel. Well, in one sense that's true, but before you get to the church, you've got to go through four books that are still pretty much Old Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the Gospels are the locus classicus, where you find all the references that we're going to need for the NTP, the New Testament period on Judaism, which is distinguished, as we described last time, from the Talmudic era, which comes later, from the Mosaic era, which comes earlier, and all the other things that I had to say as well. Circumcision would be Luke chapter 2 and verse 21. I think that a lot of Christians, as they read their Bible, I'm talking about the Gospels, the New Testament, they fail to appreciate its Jewishness. Its Jewishness. Now, remember, or maybe you've forgotten because it was one that was not that important, but last Sunday we looked at one of our translations, the authentic New Testament, and what Hugh Sconfield had to say was that only a Jewish scholar could translate the New Testament, because only a Jewish scholar could appreciate the Jewishness behind the New Testament documents. And I said in the first place that is a questionable thesis, but I also said that it's rather interesting. He had that notion and idea. It is not the Gospels. We're talking about the Gospels now. It is not a Gentile passage or document, the four Gospels. They're purely Jewish. They're filled with Jewish notions and Jewish ideas. As you move later into the New Testament, although you're still dealing with Jewish ideas, you have increasingly so, a Gentile church. But I think that a lot of Christians fail to appreciate the fact that there is a very strong Jewishness behind the New Testament, especially behind the four Gospels. And in reading this, all they can think as they turn from old to new is the death of the old way, the death of the earlier or the older covenant. They fail to remember that a lot of it is carried over legitimately right into the new. So circumcision is one of those examples. Luke 2:21. Luke 2:21. And you see, we start with this because of the, kind of the anti-circumcision slant that so much of the rest of the New Testament has. And so Christians think of that automatically and fail to remember that it was part of the law, and a legitimate part at that. When 8 days were accomplished for the circumcision of the child, his name was called, and look who we're talking about. His name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. People have all types of notions in their religious relics and paintings of what Jesus looks like, and it's rarely like a Jewishman. They would tend to make him in our Anglo-Saxon image, not with the Jewish nose, but an English one, as we've often said. And they would probably not think, maybe especially in earlier days, they would simply not think of Jesus as being a circumcised child, but that he was. Number two, sacrifice. Sacrifice is carried right over into the New Testament. And I know we're talking about the gospel still, but I've also said that's where we're going to spend most of our time. That's where the Jewishness comes out most strongly. Same chapter, 3 verses later. And to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord. The law of the Lord, a pair of turtle dove or 2 young pigeons. Now, Jesus isn't offering this for himself, but Mary is offering it. But in giving birth to the Son of God, who will become the Lamb, capital L, that taketh away the sin of the world, John 1:29, the sacrifice of the world, a sacrifice is made at his birth. To be sure by his mother, but it's a sacrifice nonetheless. In Luke chapter 13 and verse 1, Luke just gives us this reference without any explanation that Pilate mingled the blood of some Galileans with their sacrifices. Luke 13:1. You don't find a lot, you see, of references of this type, such as sacrifice, unless it's speaking of Christ, or unless it's a reference to the Old Testament. But to have been practiced, at the time that the writings point to is another matter. There were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, which means that you've got people from northern Israel coming down to Jerusalem, the only place that was legitimate for the offering of sacrifices. And in John 2:15, as well as in Mark 11, 2 different occasions, Jesus goes into the temple, and what does he do in righteous indignation on one occasion? He makes a whip, and he drives out what? Sheep and oxen. What are they there for? For sacrifice. And turns over the tables of the money changers. And what are they there for? To change the money for the people to something that will approximate the Tyrian shekel from Tyre, that they can then buy appropriate sacrifice for themselves. I don't have the verse in Mark 11, but John 2:15 is the better known passage anyway. There's a second thing. In the third place, the leprosy gift. The leprosy gift is mentioned. Now this is on the basis of Leviticus 14, verses 1 through 32. Leviticus 14, 1 through 32. We find it in several places. It's in Luke 5:14. And then I'll read the Matthew 8, 1 to 4 passage where it's found, and then I'll give you another place where it's found as well. Luke 5 and Matthew 8, I think, are the same incident. When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. Behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. I will, be thou clean. And he immediately was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See you tell no man, go thy way, and show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. Now, Moses didn't command for a testimony unto them. That's a comma that Moses commanded. And Jesus said it will be a testimony unto them of the works of Christ. The healing of a leper supernaturally would obviously be an incredible work. All for the gift that Moses commanded. And you go back to the first verses in Leviticus chapter 14 and you'll see that. And then again in Luke 17, verses 11 through 19, this is a different occasion, but the leprosy gift pops up again. Luke 17, 11 through 19. It came to pass as he went to Jerusalem that he passed along the border of Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered into a certain village, there met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off. They lifted up their voices and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said unto them, Go show yourselves unto the priests. Well, by implication, the leprosy gift. You couldn't go without a gift. You had to take a gift for your cleansing. And it came to pass as they went, they were cleansed. And we know the end of that story. The fourth place, various feasts, some of them named, some of them unnamed, and the majority of them found in John. And the most important one of them being Passover. For instance, in John chapter 2 and verse 13. The reason we're pointing this out is because our studies of Judaism will have to be rather negative, because that's the whole thrust of Jesus' teaching. It's a very negative teaching. But as we started off our study of Judaism last week by saying, he is not lessening the effect of the law of Moses. It's not Jesus against the law of Moses. It's Jesus against the perversion of the law at the hand and the mouth and the pen of the Jewish rabbis. And so because it seems to be negative, we tend to forget that a lot of the Old Testament is brought right over into the New with the continuance of legitimate Jewish customs and feasts and ceremonies and liturgy and practices such as these that I'm pointing out to you now. The Jews' Passover, John 2:13, was at hand, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. John 5:1, an unnamed feast. There was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. In John 6:4, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. In John 7:2, now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. John 12 and verse 1, then Jesus 6 days before the Passover. And then the one unusual one is John 10:22, because here's an ITP feast. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament. And it was at Jerusalem the feast of the dedication. And it was winter. And what's that all about? The rededication under the Maccabees of the temple in 165 BC. The feast of dedication. The feast of dedication. Or the feast of Hanukkah and the feast of lights. Acts chapter 2 and verse 1, which is very famous to Pentecostals. They've been named after it. The feast of Pentecost. How do you like that? A whole segment of millions of people in Christendom are called Pentecostals. They're named after a Jewish feast, an Old Testament Jewish feast. They're not called Passoverites or Hanukkah-ites or something, or nameless feast-ites of John 5:1, the feast that has no name, but Pentecostals. So what do we find there? We've got Passover, we've got tabernacles, we've got dedication, we've got Pentecost. 3 Old Testament, 1 ITP. We've got 1 unnamed one, John 5:1, which is probably another Passover. So we've got 3 or 4, depending on how long you want to count in time, important Jewish feasts that are found right over in the New Testament. And you have allusions to them in other places, such as in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul says that Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. 1 Corinthians 5. Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. Well, that's a metaphorical usage, but these are literal ones in the Gospel of John in the book of Acts. And then fifthly, the liturgy of the restored temple is seen. The liturgy of the restored temple is seen in Luke 1. It's a rather long section. It concerns the priest Zechariah, his time that he spends ministering before the Lord in the temple, and the angel Gabriel appears to him. But let's start with verse 8 in Luke 1. And it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course. Now then Luke gives us a little light on the background for this. According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot. Now a lot means that they cast lots for this. You got, 24 courses of priests according to the book of Chronicles. And then you got, hundreds of priests within each course. So the chance that your lot would ever come up would be like once a lifetime. Is about what they figure it out for. The chance that you would ever have, just as a normal priest, of ever actually being in the temple and officiating anything. You'd have a once-in-a-lifetime chance for that to ever happen. So Luke explains that, and you have to kind of know that, the background of Luke 1:9, before you appreciate this appearance of Gabriel there. It's very unusual for Zechariah to be there. That's probably the first time and the last time he was ever in the temple. And Gabriel, God waits, God has all that time together so that the angel appears to him in a sacred capacity as an officiating priest chosen by sacred lot, which is probably the first and the last time that would ever happen to this man. So according to the custom, it was a custom of theirs, of the priest's office. You see, all the priests would like to, serve at the temple, but you've only got so many days and seasons, and you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of priests. And so, what other way are you going to do it? So they cast lots. And after all, remember, where does Zechariah and Elizabeth live? They don't live in Jerusalem. They live in the wilderness of Judea. If you read later in the chapter here, John lives down there. That's where he's born, the wilderness of Judea. They're up here at the temple, up here in Jerusalem, for a certain occasion, and that is the fact that he has been chosen, Zechariah, by sacred lot to fulfill the office of the priest. You probably didn't know that. That was the background to Luke 1:9. There are a whole lot of little things like this in the gospel. Some of them you know because I've alerted you to them along the way. The more you can understand about these things, the better you'll understand the New Testament. His lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. Now that means into the temple. The altar of incense is inside. The altar of burnt offering is outside. The altar of incense is inside. Now, not in the Holy of Holies, to be sure. That's only for the high priest in the holy place, but still, to get to go into the holy place, that was rare. I mean, no Israelite could go in there. You had to be of the tribe of Levi and a descendant of Aaron to get in there. But then there are thousands and thousands. There are 24 courses of priests in the book of Chronicles. 24, with thousands of priests in every course. See, we're told back up in verse 5, there was in the days of Herod the king of Judea, we've studied that little part of the verse in the political backgrounds of the ITP, a certain priest named Zechariah of the course of Abiah, the KJV says, or Abijah, to line it up with the Old Testament, of Abijah. Well, that's one of the courses. You go back to Chronicles, end of Chronicles, and you'll see that. So he is a priest, and he goes in, and this is a blessed privilege for a priest. If he has any piousness or holiness to him at all, it's a blessed office to get to go in and do this, to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. The whole multitude of the people were praying without at the time of incense. There appeared unto him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. So what I'm trying to say is that just because we're going to be critical of Judaism, we don't want to forget Mosaism, that you have to understand some of that to appreciate some of the things that you'll find in the New Testament. Then in the sixth place, simply the subject of priests, or the office of the priest. Now we've already seen some other types of offices, like the king, which is absent at this time, but the priests certainly aren't. You find them here. You find them back in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 4, the passage we looked at for the leprosy gift. Go and show yourself to the priest. The priests continue to exist, of course, even after the church makes its break from Judaism. And there are just a list of other things. I'll just give you one other example, such as in John chapter 8, the first 11 verses, the death penalty for adultery. The Jewish men caught this woman in the very act of adultery, and they said, Moses said to stone her. What do you say? Well, they were right. That was the law of Moses. That was the Old Testament teaching, the penalty of death for adultery. And there are other things. I think those are some of the major, the obvious ones, and there are some other minor ones like death penalty for adultery, and a lot of other things that you would, if you sat down and thought, you'd realize, well, this is based on the Old Testament. Although it might not so much be, liturgy or a special function or a sacred season or a religious office or duty like these things are that we've discussed. So those are positive things. In our balancing act, though, tonight, let's shift to the other foot. Some things don't appear very well. In the first place, important Old Testament features are noticeably absent in the New Testament. Can you think of some important Old Testament things that are absent in the New? What about the Day of Atonement? I mean, that was the whole heart of the matter in Old Testament Israel. Leviticus chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. Not a reference to it anywhere in the Gospels. The Sabbatic years. The year of Jubilee, which is a special type of Sabbatic year. And a whole host of other Old Testament laws. There's not a reference to them in the New Testament. Now, to be sure, lack of reference need not necessarily imply their absence. But when something is as important as the Day of Atonement, and you don't have any reference to it at all, then it has certainly set some scholars to scratching their heads and thinking, why no reference? Is it because, is the implication that they had ceased that function in Israel? Well, of course, without any New Testament references, we wouldn't be able to answer one way or the other. But you could turn to writings and you'd have to answer that would not be true. The Day of Atonement is still found. But it's not in the New Testament, though. Neither are the Sabbatic years, neither is the year of Jubilee, neither are a whole lot of other courses and offices and sacrifices and liturgy and events that you find in the Old. But we've also got to remember, just because, and here's something that I think very few people in the churches of our day know anything about, which is a study in itself in Old Testament practice and theology, that there were many Old Testament laws which were either never or rarely ever recorded in the Old Testament itself as being practiced after the initial giving. So just because we don't have a reference in the New doesn't mean that it isn't valid or that it wasn't being practiced. Now, it could imply that, especially the latter, that it's not being practiced. But we have to remember that in the Old Testament itself, many laws were given by Moses that are seen in the Pentateuch as being given, but never seen in any historical section of the Old Testament as ever being practiced. And I'll give you one good, famous example that we wish we had a little more information about. And that's in Numbers chapter 5, the so-called trial of jealousy. That if a man suspected his wife of having committed adultery on him, then he was to go through this sacred session of dust and blotting and writing in a book and go to the tabernacle and go to the priests. What about all those cases of sexual sin in the Old Testament? All of the cases of adultery in the Old Testament? All of the, I'm sure, times where men were suspicious? Not a single record of Numbers 5 ever being put into practice. So, and that goes way back into ancient Jewish history, and we don't have things like the Talmud that would give us information about that. So where the Scripture is silent, I guess we would have to be silent. I don't know whether it was ever practiced or not. But I'll tell you what my guess is. My guess is that no. My guess is based on the fact that the Jews had a hard time ever obeying the important things. I mean, the major things. They were always going a-whoring after other gods and forsaking God and disobeying the law of Moses. And so when you come across something that's mentioned only once and not fortified in several books, like in the initial Pentateuch and then finally in its repetition in Deuteronomy, such as the trial of jealousy, then I don't know, maybe the odds are that never was practiced anywhere in the Old Testament. That's not God's fault, and the people were wrong for not practicing it. God wasted his breath, as it were, to give the law of the trial of jealousy and have it never practiced or realized in Israel. And then on occasions, the lack of reference does imply the absence of the practice. Okay, you see what I'm saying? Just because we don't have references doesn't necessarily imply their absence. But on some occasions, the lack of reference does imply the absence of practice. I'll give you the best example if you'll turn to the last chapter of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 21. 2 Chronicles 36:21. Now here's an occasion where we have an Old Testament law that was given. Moses said, do this. Do all my laws, you'll be blessed and live. And here's one of them, do this. You don't find any recorded observances of this law. So does a lack of reference imply an absence of practice? Well, according to 2 Chronicles 36:21, yes. In this case, yes. To fulfill, he sent them into Babylon for 70 years, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now there's a lot of debate on what that verse means. I mean, 70, you've got your 70 years there. Is that Babylonian captivity, or is that the number of Sabbath years, which would come every 7 years? The number of Sabbath years, or the period of Sabbath years, which have not been observed in Israel. You get 70 years and you multiply them by 7, and you're talking about a half a millennium of time in Israel's history, if that interpretation is true, that the sabbatic year was not practiced. Now, again, we can't get into that in this study, but I'll just say that's a very interesting study right there. Were the sabbatic laws kept? Remember that you could sow and reap for 6 years. In the 7th year, the land was given rest. The animals were given rest. Everybody had rest for a whole year. But if I know man and his economic greed, he hates to think I've got to waste a whole year here. So he says, well, I'll work the 7th year. And then I'll work the 14th year, and the 21st year, and the 28th year, breaking every one of those sabbatic laws, and probably working on the Sabbath as well. I don't want to take a day off. I can work. You know how our world out there thinks. Have to give up a day of work? Think if they had to give up a year of work every 7 years. The only place where, yeah, praise God, that would be good. When am I going to get my sabbatical around here? I've been here about 7 years. I'm supposed to get a year of study in Cambridge or something. Well, I was going to say, that's the only place, hardly, where it's kept anymore, is in academic institutions, where you have your so-called, what do they call it, a sabbatical. I mean, you can find the most atheistic, secular university around, and it's based right on the Old Testament, the sabbatical year. They give their professors, do they not, a 7th year. You've been there 6 years? Well, it depends on the institution. But the good ones, you get a half a sabbatical or a full one or whatever. You get 12 months off. That's 12 months pay. That's 12 months, because they were doing it at every university or wherever. They're doing it all the time. And you've got to juggle when you're going to get there and who's going to be there whenever you're there. Because you never have everyone there. That's the problem with students down at Gordon Conwell. The year I was there, such and such and such and such were on their sabbatical. And so people time when they're going to schools, if they're, wanting to get a certain professor or lecture or something, on the basis of how long these men have been there. But you teach 6 years, you get 1 year off, 12 months. No lecture responsibilities, no duties there. Now, they expect you not to go fishing and play golf for 12 months. You got to go somewhere and write and research and get built back up to teach for 6 more years. But that's a blessing. And some corporations give that, by the way. You have a sabbatical year. They're still based right on the Old Testament law. But most of the world's going to give up on that notion, though, of taking a year off. Then, every 14 years, you've really only worked 12, 2 years off. So we're told here in 2 Chronicles 36:21, very specifically, God said, one of the reasons you're going to Babylon is because you have raped the land. And you're going to go there and fulfill 70 years. You're going to fulfill the time that has been stolen from the land here in Palestine. It's taken, and modern man sometimes still doesn't learn, a long time to learn the practice of letting some ground lie fallow. It just won't keep producing unless you just pour on the fertilizer every year, but you're damaging the ground. Amen. And anybody who has any sense, you watch and you'll look at a field, and it'll have crops for a couple of years or so, and all of a sudden you drive by there and it's all green grass that year. Someone's smart. They're letting the nutrients build back up in the ground. But some people don't do that. They'll drain every ounce of nutrient they can get out of the ground. And that's a horror in the eyes of God. We've been talking, son, in modern technology and Christian ethics about some of the ethical Old Testament principles. This was an Old Testament law. This wasn't a principle. They didn't have an option to take the seventh year off or not. This was a law. For the New Testament Christian, it's certainly not a law, but it is a principle, though. It is a principle. There's a whole lot hidden back there in Moses' teaching. In Leviticus, lost in Leviticus, numbed in Numbers people get. And they can't even find the things that are there that are relative and applicable for today. So, like I say, where's my sabbatical? Nobody else wants to follow that principle. I guess I'll volunteer to follow it. Full year off of work. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbath.
For the
To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. Because it's not only the person who owns the land, it's the servants, it's the animals. Year after year after year. Something's wrong with modern technology and modern man today in the West. It's just workaholic, nonstop, all the time, until you just burn yourself out and burn everybody else out and ruin the machinery and everything. No one wants to stop and take a break. The Old Testament, you had a Sabbath day, you had a Sabbath year, you had a 50th year. Everybody had to be released. All slaves released. All debts canceled. God knew that there's a certain way you have to establish society or you'll end up ruined, like we're doing with the modern West today. Amen. Can you imagine that? A day of the week, a year, and a 50th year where everybody's set free. Everybody's blessed. The year of Jubilee. They were to blow silver trumpets in that year. It was such a glorious year. Everyone returned all their possessions. If you'd lost some land some way, all your land was free of charge returned to you. All debts were canceled. And God even warned the people, don't think in that 49th year you're not going to loan any money. He specifically gave that warning. He knew man's heart that, it's only going to be, a year from now. And if they don't have time to pay, and they won't in a year, it'll be canceled. Now I'll loan them in the first year of a 50th year cycle. They got 50 years to pay me back. And God said, don't think in your evil heart not to loan in that 49th year just because you won't get your money back. Because you know what? They wouldn't get their money back. If you didn't get it back in 12 months, that debt was canceled, according to the law of Moses. So I find this to be a very interesting law. It's got many, many ramifications to it. The whole Sabbath question, the day, the year, and the 50th year, is one subject you see together. It concerns economics, and it concerns personal rest and rejuvenation, and what we call today, which is a good name, we just don't think of what we're saying, recreation. What that is recreation. Don't go out and kill yourself. It's to recreate yourself. Recreation is to be recreated. That's where we got the term, by the way. All this, I think, goes back to the same social economic issue that's dealt with so thoroughly, and with such foresight by God in His wisdom in the Old Testament. By the way, you see, that's what the theonomists are after. They're wanting to restore all of the Old Testament law for today. Well, they've got some good points on their side, but they're missing it in some other areas. So the reason we're over to 2 Chronicles 36 is I said that on occasions lack of reference in the Old, or perhaps in the New, lack of reference does imply the absence of the practice. And you simply, as you read Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, don't find people practicing this sabbatic year, taking the 7th year off. The assumption is, and I think it's proven by 2 Chronicles 36:21, is that people are working one another and themselves to death, to the bone, to get money. You say, well, what's the way around that? Well, let's go back to what God said in Deuteronomy 28. God said, if you'll obey me, all these blessings will come on you, and they will overtake you. All these blessings will come on you. The people had sinned through all these years. They couldn't make ends meet in 6 years. They couldn't get the greed and the covetousness out of their heart. They wanted to take that Sabbath day in that 7th year, and if they could, the year of Jubilee as well. And I think that in Matthew 23 and verse 4, a verse we looked at last time, the innumerable additions to the law that Jesus speaks of are perhaps the worst thing that we find as we compare Old Testament with New Testament, Mosaism with Judaism. Now, with the time I have left, if you'll turn over to Matthew's Gospel, here's what we're going to briefly do tonight. This is a synopsis. This is a brief overview of the Judaism that exists behind Matthew's Gospel. And you say, why pick Matthew? Because Matthew is the most Jewish of the 4 Gospels. John would be second behind, and Mark and Luke would follow. Matthew's the most Jewish of the Gospels. And what I want to do is take you through a very easy, non-thorough list. See, there I go again, saying we can't cover everything. Of places in Matthew's Gospel where Judaism pops up. We're only looking at one book, Matthew's Gospel, and I'm sure there are more places than those that I will give you that I just picked out in skimming over the book. Let's go point by point, chapter by chapter, and I want to show you things that if we understand something about Judaism and or, let me say, Mosaism, we can understand something more about our Christian documents, the New Testament. Number 1, the place of women. The place of women is already hinted at in Matthew 1. That is, that in the perspective of Judaism, their place is not very high. Matthew contradicts that. Matthew contradicts that by implication. That would be in verse 3 and verses 5 and 6 in the genealogy. See, what I've done is I sat down and just skimmed Matthew, went chapter by chapter, asking myself, where do I find Judaism? Where do I find an Old Testament connection here? Besides the list of all the names here that are obviously an Old Testament connection. Something to the spirit of Judaism. That if I understand that, I understand what's being said here, and maybe more importantly, why. Verse 3, and Judas begat Phares and Zara of Tamar. Verse 5, Solomon begat Boaz of Rahab. And Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. Verse 6, and Jesse begat David the king, and David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. You don't ever find women in the names of Jewish genealogies. That is just contrary to the spirit of Judaism. Descendants are counted by their fathers, not by their mothers. And you've already given us the fathers here anyway. Jesse begat David the king. David begat Solomon. Solomon, well, you see, he didn't. I skipped something. David begat Solomon. Solomon begat. We've already got all the begats here. We've got the immediate connection. We don't need this business thrown in of her that had been the wife of Uriah. Why do we have that thrown in there? We've already got the fathers. That's an extra additional bit of information that serves no purpose in a strict genealogy. Now, if you don't know the father's name, give the mother. We've got the father here, though. Why give the mother at all? Well, as I just said, what Matthew's trying to do is contradict the prevailing Jewish notion of the low place that women have. He goes back and picks out not only women, but infamous women in infamous cases as well. And I think he has some other things to imply by that. In the second place, marriage and courtship laws. Marriage and courtship laws have to be understood in current first century Jewish practice if we want to understand Matthew 1, verses 18 and 19. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise when, as his mother Mary was espoused. Espoused. Now, espoused to us means engaged. Espoused to Joseph. Before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. When Joseph, her husband, now we've gone beyond engagement to marriage. But nothing has happened. The relationship hasn't furthered itself or developed any since then. We've got engagement, the espousing of one to another. That's engagement. That's betrothal. And then we've got marriage, or at least he's called her husband in verse 19. Well, that's not a misprint or anything. It can be explained. How you can say they're engaged in verse 18, and then how you can call Joseph her husband in verse 19. You see, you can't do that in our society. You can't call engaged people husbands and wives, not until after they get married. Jewish society, you could. They weren't married, they were engaged, but they were husband and wife. That becomes important for teachings on divorce and remarriage, by the way. Number 3, views on the Messiah, according to chapter 2 and verse 3. We looked at that a while back. This may seem a little confusing to you tonight. That's what I'm sensing, that you don't know exactly what's going on. Number 4, so I'm just going to pretend I don't sense that. Reliance on physical descent. Reliance upon physical descent. Matthew 3 and verse 9. Now this you're probably a little more familiar with. John the Baptist said to those Pharisees and Sadducees, "Think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham." Why did they say that? We have Abraham, or why did he suspect that was what they were thinking? We have Abraham to our father. Well, a certain philosophy of theirs that was based on physical genealogy and physical descent. Preaching in Galilee, chapter 4 and verse 12. Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. Now why into Galilee? There's a certain reason why. Only if you understand, this has nothing to do with the Old Testament here. I said Judaism and or Mosaism will be some type of background to what we're talking about now. Only if you understand first century Judaism could you appreciate why Jesus based almost his entire ministry in Galilee, why that's where he was raised, and he immediately goes there to preach. Matthew 4:12. Now, Lord willing, I think next week we might pull this example out of this, a bunch of examples, the subject of the relationship of Galilee to the rest of the nation of Israel, and I'll develop that a little more, so you can save your questions on that until then. Number 6, Jesus teaching on externals. Jesus teaching on externals in Matthew chapters 5 and 6. Remember the question of anger and murder, lust and adultery, the taking of the oath. You get over into chapter 6, you have praying, giving of gifts, fasting, these external type things. Again, we have studied that in several connections in this church, why he's saying certain things that he's saying, especially in Matthew chapter 5. But it's true in chapter 6 as well. Number 7, his style of teaching. Matthew 7, verses 28 to 29. his style of teaching, Matthew 7:28 to 29. If you turn over here, I'll explain this one real quickly, briefly to you, and you'll remember that we talked about this before. It came to pass when Jesus had in other words, this is not an American Western book here. You have to understand other things to understand its background. And what I'm trying to show, if you notice your notes so far, we're not skipping a chapter in Matthew. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now we're in, or 6, now we're in 7. Every chapter of Matthew. Your knowledge, your understanding of Matthew is going to be dependent on some other knowledge that you have to have that you might not be able to get just from reading Matthew, especially if we don't think as we read. It came to pass when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Well, how do you teach as though you have authority? Does that mean you shout and holler, or you pound with your fist? I mean, what does it mean to teach with authority? Well, there's one thing that Matthew means here. The scribes were always quoting case law decisions. It was said by Rabbi such and such case that thus is true. Well, that kind of weakens it down. You're quoting some ancient soul somewhere. When Jesus come along saying, "Verily, verily, I say unto you." He never quoted anybody. He said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you." It was with his own dignity and person he gave forth his message. The people recognize that. This one isn't quoting the rabbis. If he ever quotes them, he quotes to correct them. No scribe would ever do that. That's the one thing Matthew's after. How else would we interpret this, that he taught us having authority? The scribes weren't, just going around like a shriveled prune with a high-pitched voice and shaking knees, and so we could see they didn't have any authority. They might have said it in a strong voice and pounded the pulpit, as it were. But when you're quoting some dead, bygone rabbi, or quoting what a rabbi said that another rabbinical court decided, the people are going to get to thinking after a while, well, I don't know whether I believe that. I don't even know whether the fellow telling me believes that. He's just quoting some law book, a textbook. And they noticed when Jesus came along, he said in this context of the Sermon on the Mount, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you." You see, that's the whole thrust of the scribes. Ye have heard that it hath been said, because what hath been said is the right thing. Jesus said, "You've heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you." That really struck the people. You see, you and I can't even appreciate that if you're not raised under that. You can't even appreciate what I'm telling you right now tonight. You're just sitting there thinking, well, doesn't sound too great to me. But if every teacher you had ever heard came to you and stood up with his book and gave you a list of quotations from ancient authors, and then closed the book and said, well, that's the end, and you heard that all of your life, and then someone came to you and said, "You have heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you," you'd do a double take in a hurry. Who does he think he is? What type of person is this? With what authority he taught. You see what I'm saying now? That's what's behind Matthew's statement here. You wouldn't know otherwise. But you'd have to think as you're reading along here, what does it mean that Jesus taught with authority? That he taught with authority, and the scribes didn't teach with authority. Well, what I've just been saying. Not only the verily, verilies, which we find, especially over in John's Gospel, but what I said in the second place here, ye have heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you. That was a revolutionary form of teaching. Not to come and quote the rabbis and rabbinical court decisions. To come and with your own personal dignity and authority, deliver it. So that everything you said, the message that you were delivering, was dependent on your own dignity and authority. That you and the people got this as he went along. They realized, who do you make yourself out to be? They knew he was claiming to be God, to speak with the very voice of God. The prophets, they even knew that in the Old Testament the prophets weren't that vain. They came and said, "Thus saith the Lord." And you see and they knew that. The Old Testament, the prophet said, "Thus saith the Lord." By the time we get to the New, the rabbis are saying, "Thus saith the Rabbi." They knew we've lost something in the intertestamental period, if nothing else. They said, "Thus saith the Lord." Now they're saying, "Thus saith the Rabbi." And here comes one that says, "Thus saith myself," Well, the apostles got the revelation in John 14:6 when he said, I am the truth. I am the truth. I don't have to quote anybody. I don't have to say, thus saith the Lord or thus saith the rabbis. I am the truth. And that was shocking to the disciples as well whenever they heard that. They were used to this same form of teaching. All right, let's go on. Praise the Lord. Number 8, his teaching on the kingdom children. His teaching on who are the kingdom children. Well, any Jew knew who the kingdom children were. Those were Jews. Well, not according to Jesus. Volumes in Jewish circles had been written on this, on who are the kingdom children. That was the catchphrase, the kingdom children. Matthew 8:10-12. Look at this. We've got a centurion's servant. Now, a centurion was a Gentile, a Roman, who's healed. And Jesus, when he heard it, marveled and said, I've not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And I say unto you, here goes his authority again. And I say unto you, that many shall come from the east and the west. Now, those are metaphors for Gentile lands. Israel in the Old Testament is called the navel of the earth. We looked at that in the studies in creation. It's called the navel of the earth. East and west means not Jewish, Gentile. And shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom, that is the ones who are saying, we are the children of the kingdom. But the children of the kingdom, who are the children of the kingdom? But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, the rabbis had a whole theology on kingdom children. And Jesus said, yeah, that's right. And the kingdom children are going to be in outer darkness, where the fire is not quenched and the worm doesn't die. And can you imagine? I mean, maybe you can appreciate more now why they crucified him. What he came saying was totally contrary to everything that was being taught in Judaism of the first century. He came and overturned not only those tables, but I mean metaphorical tables. He turned the tables on the people of his day. They killed him as a result of that. And who were the instigators of that? The religious leaders. He overthrew all of their teaching, all of their authority. Everything they had to say, he came and contradicted it. They had their theology of kingdom children. Kingdom children are Jews. Jesus said kingdom children will be thrown into hell. And kingdom children, in the final analysis, will be those from the east and the west. And look who they get to sit down with. The great triplet, trios set of the Old Testament. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Sitting with pagans, heathens, dogs. That's what Jesus said. The Gentiles will sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Jews will be thrown into hell. Rather revolutionary, is it not? Hallelujah. It's always revolutionary when you overthrow religious authority. Number 9, those with whom he kept company. Those with whom he kept company. Chapter 9. Every number, as you see, will correspond with the chapter, especially in these later sections here. Verses 10 through 13. What do we have? Tax collectors and sinners. And they sat down with him and his disciples. The Pharisees saw it, and they said, why eateth your master with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus, when he heard it, said, they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, for I'm not come to call the righteous, quote unquote. They weren't righteous, of course, but sinners to repentance. Number 10, the presence of synagogues. Now, you don't find that in the Old Testament, synagogues. That has to be something in between. The presence of synagogues, chapter 10 and verse 17. Beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. Number 11, his reference to children's games, to Jewish children's games. Now, we play, what, hopscotch or pin the tail on the donkey or whatever. Well, the Jewish children had games, not those. They had their own, and they're mentioned right in the Bible in Matthew 11, verses 16 and 17. You have to understand the background or you wouldn't catch the meaning. And it's a rather powerful critique of his here. He said, "Whereunto shall I liken this generation? It is like unto children sitting in the markets and calling unto their fellows." Have you ever read these verses and kind of been a little mystified? Well, I wonder what he means here. Well, it's because you never played Jewish hopscotch, I guess. And saying, "We have piped unto you, and you have not danced. We have mourned unto you, and ye have not lamented." What's he mean by that? He's talking about current games that are played by Jewish children. "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he hath a demon. And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, he's a gluttonous man and a winebibber, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified of her children." Kind of a mystical passage, is it not? So you've got to understand something of the Jewishness behind it. Number 12, Sabbath laws. Sabbath laws, chapter 12, verses 1 to 14. Now, I just said earlier in the definition of Judaism, that is one of the four major tenets: Sabbath, circumcision, monotheism, and anti-idolatry. We've got several tapes on this section of Matthew in the Christian Ethics series. The Sabbath laws. Number 13, the mention of scribes. The mention of scribes in this particular function of theirs. Now, scribes are mentioned in the Old Testament, but not in the function in which they appear in the New. We'll say more about them as you'll see on our outline later. Chapter 13 and verse 52. "Then said he unto them, Therefore every scribe which is instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and things old." Another kind of mystical, unusual verse. So you'd have to know something about the scribes to know what he means there. Number 14, his teaching on, or really against, tradition, or the tradition of the elders, as it is called. You have to skip a chapter here, Matthew 15, verses 1 through 20. I've been wanting to get to this just to show you how much Jewishness permeates the gospel accounts, especially Matthew. Just fill with it. Just fill with it. And my argument for how many years has been that you just really can't understand the New Testament without understanding the Old, and furthermore without understanding some of the ITP Jewishness behind it. Number 15, the asking for a sign. The asking for a sign, chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. Number 16, the question of the tribute money. Chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. Number 17, the question of the frequency of forgiveness. Peter said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times? The rabbis had a teaching on that. The question of forgiveness, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Oh, certainly, number 18, the subject of divorce. The subject of divorce and remarriage was a big problem in Jewish circles then, as it was before, and I guess ever since then. Chapter 19, verses 1 to 12. Jesus gives his own teaching on divorce and remarriage. Number 19. We don't have time to read all of these, that's why I'm going a little quickly now. The authority question. Now, this isn't just the people recognizing authority in his teaching, but the religious leaders challenging the source of his authority. The authority question in 21, verses 23 through 27. It's similar to what I said under point 7, his style of teaching. but it's just a slightly different twist in the setting of the question. The authority question. Look at Matthew 21:23. The leaders ask him, the chief priests and elders, "By what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority?" You have to be following one of the rabbinical schools. You have to be commissioned by a rabbi. You got to be a disciple under a rabbi. He didn't study under anybody. You say, "Well, I remember a time when he was a boy asking questions, trying to learn some from the religious leaders when he was the age 12. Well, he wasn't asking to learn anything. He was asking them questions to see whether they could answer his questions or not. He's not there trying to learn something. He's talking to them, telling them things, asking them questions in the temple to see whether or not they can answer him. He's studied under no authorities at all. But he knows everything, it seems. He's got an opinion about everything. And he knows the Old Testament, and he knows how to hit the religious leaders where it hurts. So they say, "Where'd you get this authority? Your degrees, your school, who gave you this authority?" You have to have authority before you're allowed to teach in Israel. So the authority question. Number 20, the greatest commandment question. We've looked at that in ethics as well. We've studied love. Chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. 22, verses 35 through 40. Which is the greatest commandment? And finally, remember, a lawyer comes and asks him, "Well, what is the greatest commandment?" Because they've been discussing it back and forth. What's the greatest commandment? And he tells them, "Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets." Number 21, the teaching on the oath. In chapter 23, verses 16 through 22. Which, again, we've got teaching on in our ethics tapes. And then to tell you the truth, didn't even bother with chapters 24 through 28, because you have him in the last week at Jerusalem, where the whole context is a Jewish context. The Passover, the sacrifice, the Paschal lamb, the whole issue is a Jewish issue there. And you've got prophecies from the Old Testament quoted, and it's just filled with Jewishness. So I stopped purposely with chapter 23. And, chapter 23 itself is just chock full of problems. It's dealing with the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, remember. So it's just chock full of problems of Jesus versus the Judaism of the first century. And when you go into his teaching on eschatology in 24, that doesn't square. The goats and the sheep doesn't square in 25. Then by the time you get to 26, you're talking about the Last Supper. And 27, the crucifixion. And 28, the end of the book. And I'm sure I must have missed a few things along the way as well. So, that should give you an adequate, although it's a non-thorough overview of the Judaism that exists behind Matthew's Gospel. So why are we looking at ITP? Why are we looking at the religious side to ITP? It's because it is extremely necessary for a study of the New Testament.